October 1935. A quiet training ground outside Berlin. Heinz Guderian stood beside a squat, awkward-looking vehicle with two machine guns mounted where a cannon should have been. It looked almost comical. Barely 5 tons, thin-skinned, unimpressive. But Guderian did not see a toy. He saw the seed of a revolution. Germany had been forbidden tanks since Versailles. For over a decade, its officers had trained with wooden mock-ups and painted trucks, pretending. Now, under Hitler's rearmament, that pretending was over. The Panzer Kampfwagen I was never meant to fight real battles. It was meant to teach a generation of crews how to move, how to communicate by radio, how to think as a single armoured fist instead of scattered steel. Guderian had spent years arguing a controversial idea. The tanks should not be scattered among infantry divisions as support weapons, but concentrated, given their own doctrine, their own speed, their own momentum. Many senior officers thought him reckless. Hitler, watching a demonstration in 1934, had reportedly turned to his generals and said simply that this was what he needed: fast, decisive, overwhelming. By 1936, over 1,000 Panzer A's had rolled off production lines. They were sent quietly to Spain, into the hands of Franco's nationalists, where German crews tested their machine in real combat for the first time. The results were sobering. Soviet-built tanks supplied to the Republicans outgunned them easily. The Panzer I could barely dent an enemy vehicle, let alone destroy one. It didn't matter. The lesson Germany needed wasn't in the tank's armor plate, it was in the men learning to fight inside it. Crews who once served in cavalry regiments were becoming something new. Tank commanders who trusted speed over strength, coordination over brute force. By the time Guderian addressed his officers in the summer of 1939, the Panzer I was already becoming obsolete on paper. But the doctrine born beside that unimpressive little tank, concentrated armor, radio coordination, combined arms moving as one organism, was about to be unleashed on Poland. The world had no name yet for what was coming. Within weeks they would call it Blitzkrieg. September 1st, 1939. Dawn over the Polish frontier. Engines roared to life in the mist along a border that had existed for barely 2 decades. Among the armoured columns crossing into Poland rolled a slightly larger, slightly deadlier descendant of Guderian's training tank, the Panzer II, armed with a 20mm autocannon capable of tearing through light armour and infantry alike. The Panzer II was never meant to be a war-winning weapon either. It was a stopgap, rushed into mass production because Germany's more capable tanks, the Panzer III and IV, were still crawling through design delays and factory shortages. Yet stopgaps, in the hands of a doctrine built for speed, became something else entirely. Polish cavalry, still partly reliant on horses, found themselves facing armoured spearheads moving faster than any army had moved before. Panzer IIs punched through gaps, exploited confusion, and raced deep behind enemy lines before defenders could regroup. It wasn't the tank's firepower that broke Poland in 5 weeks, it was tempo. Guderian's theory, tested in miniature in Spain, now played out across an entire nation. By May 1940, that same tempo turned toward France. Panzer IIs led columns through the Ardennes forest, a route French planners had dismissed as impassable for armour. German crews, cramped and exhausted, pushed their machines through narrow tracks the enemy never expected to defend. When they emerged near Sedan, the French High Command was still convinced the real attack would come further north. The psychological shock outweighed the tank's modest specifications. French and British forces, better armed on paper in many respects, found themselves outmaneuvered by speed and initiative rather than steel and caliber. Dunkirk followed. Paris fell in June. The Panzer II had done its work, not as a superior weapon, but as an instrument of a doctrine no other army had fully embraced. Yet even as victory parades marched through Paris, German planners already knew this small tank's days were numbered. A larger, harder-hitting machine was waiting in the wings, and a war against an enemy no one in Berlin had yet dared to name that was already being quietly planned. June 22nd, 1941. The Soviet border before sunrise. Over. 3,000 German tanks sat idling in the darkness, engines humming low, crews staring east into a silence that would not last another hour. Operation Barbarossa was about to begin, the largest invasion in military history, and at its spearhead rolled the Panzer III, now the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armoured divisions. Armed with a 50mm gun and better armoured than its predecessors, the Panzer III represented Germany's confidence at its peak. Early victories came fast. Entire Soviet armies were encircled at Minsk, then Smolensk, then Kiev, where over 600,000 Red Army soldiers were captured in a single encirclement. German tank crews advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, convinced the campaign would be over before winter. Then, in a nondescript encounter near the Dubno-Brody sector, and more famously later that year, German crews encountered something they hadn't planned for. The Soviet T-34. Sloped armor deflected German shells that should have penetrated. A more powerful main gun outranged the Panzer III entirely. For the first time in the war, German tankers radioed back reports tinged not with confidence, but with alarm. Guderian himself, now commanding Panzer Group II, received these reports with growing unease. The machine that had conquered Poland and France was, gun for gun, now inferior to what it faced. Engineers back in Germany were urgently ordered to study captured T-34s, and design teams began sketching what would eventually become the Panther. But that solution was still years away. In the meantime, Panzer III crews adapted by relying on tactics rather than technology, flanking maneuvers, coordinated ambushes, calling in Luftwaffe support to compensate for what their cannons could not achieve alone. By December 1941, German tanks stood within sight of Moscow suburbs, close enough that some crews claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Then temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Engines froze. Lubricants turned to paste. The offensive that had seemed unstoppable in June ground to a halt, not from enemy resistance alone, but from a Russian winter that showed no mercy to steel or flesh. Autumn 1942, Stalingrad's shattered outskirts. By now, the Panzer IV had become the true workhorse of the Wehrmacht, upgraded repeatedly with a longer 75mm gun capable of matching the T-34 on more even terms. It was not the most elegant design, nor the most feared, but it was reliable, adaptable, and produced in numbers the more advanced Panther and Tiger never matched. At Stalingrad, however, numbers and adaptability meant little in the rubble of a city fighting street by street, room by room. Tanks that had thrived on open-steppe warfare found themselves trapped in urban corridors where infantry with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails could strike from windows and cellars. General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, supported by these Panzer IVs, pushed deeper into the city through the autumn, capturing factory districts inch by bloody inch. Then in November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a pincer movement that encircled the entire Sixth Army, tanks included, inside Stalingrad's ruins. Panzer IV crews who had spent months attacking now found themselves defending a shrinking pocket with dwindling fuel and ammunition. Some tanks were used as immobile pillboxes, their engines silent, their guns still firing until shells ran out entirely. By February 1943, what remained of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the armoured vehicles that had entered the city, only a fraction escaped the encirclement before the ring closed. It was the first unmistakable sign visible to the entire world that the war on the Eastern Front had turned. Yet even as Stalingrad fell, German engineers pressed forward on two new designs meant to restore the balance the T-34 had upset. One was heavier, slower, nearly invulnerable from the front. The other was faster, sleeker, borrowing directly from lessons learned fighting Soviet armor. Both were being rushed toward a battlefield in central Russia that would soon become the largest tank engagement engagement the world had ever seen. Summer 1943, the Kursk salient. Adolf Hitler delayed the offensive for weeks, waiting for new tanks to arrive in sufficient numbers before committing to what German planners called Operation Citadel. Among them was the Tiger I, a 57-ton monster armed with an 88mm gun capable of destroying a T-34 from over a kilometer away, its front armor thick enough to shrug off most Soviet rounds entirely. Tiger crews approached Kursk with a confidence bordering on invincibility. In earlier engagements in Tunisia and on the Eastern Front, single Tigers had destroyed a dozen or more enemy tanks in an afternoon without loss. But Soviet intelligence had learned of the coming offensive months in advance, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified defensive zone in military history. Layered minefields, anti-tank ditches, and thousands of artillery pieces waiting in depth. On July 5th, 1943, German armor advanced into that gauntlet. Tigers led the spearheads, but their numbers were too few to dominate a battlefield of this scale. Behind them came Panzer IVs, and the newly arrived Panthers rushed into combat before mechanical faults in their transmissions and engines had been fully resolved. Many broke down before ever firing a shot. Near the village of Prokhorovka on July 12th, hundreds of tanks from both sides collided in a battle that would become legend, though its scale has since been debated by historians studying the original records more carefully. Confusion, smoke, and burning wrecks turned coordinated maneuver into chaotic, close-range slaughter. German technical superiority, tank for tank, could not overcome Soviet numbers and prepared defenses. Kursk ended not in the decisive German victory Hitler had gambled on, but in a slow, grinding withdrawal. It was the last major offensive the Wehrmacht would ever launch in the east. From this point forward, German tank crews would fight defensively, retreating steadily westward, their technological edge increasingly outweighed by an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany ever could. Normandy, June and July 1944. The Panther rushed into service after Kursk had by now matured into arguably the finest all-around tank of the war. Sloped armor inspired directly by the T-34, a devastating high-velocity 75mm gun, and a silhouette low enough to conceal it in hedgerows and forest edges. In the bocage country of Normandy, that silhouette became deadly. Allied tank crews advancing inland from the beaches discovered quickly that their Sherman tanks, effective against earlier German designs, struggled badly against a well-positioned Panther. British and American units began referring grimly to the phenomenon of a single German tank halting an entire advancing column, its long gun barrel visible only for a moment before another Sherman went up in flames. Crews adopted a dark nickname for their own vehicles, born from how easily they burned when struck. Yet Panthers, like the Tigers before them, suffered from mechanical fragility and complexity that slowed production and repair. Allied numbers combined with total air superiority meant the German armor increasingly fought not open battles but desperate isolated actions, ambushing a column, then withdrawing before airstrikes could locate them. Michael Wittmann, a Tiger commander already renowned on the Eastern Front, demonstrated this pattern near Villers-Bocage in mid-June 1944, destroying more than a dozen British vehicles in a matter of minutes before withdrawing. Actions like his became propaganda triumphs for Berlin, but they could not alter the wider trajectory of the campaign. For every such engagement, dozens of German tanks were lost to artillery, airstrikes, or simple lack of fuel, as Allied bombing crippled Germany's oil production. By August 1944, the Falaise Pocket closed around what remained of German armor in Normandy. Panthers and Tigers alike were abandoned by the roadside, their crews retreating on foot, fuel tanks empty. The tanks that had once symbolized German battlefield superiority were now being destroyed not primarily in combat, but discarded for want of the resources needed to keep them moving. at all. Winter 1944 into the spring of 1945. In the Ardennes forest, the same dense woodland that had carried German tanks to victory in 1940. A new generation of armour made its final desperate offensive. King Tigers, the heaviest tanks Germany ever fielded in significant numbers, weighing nearly 70 tons and armed with a devastating long-barreled 88mm gun, spearheaded what Hitler hoped would be a war-altering counterattack toward Antwerp. The offensive, launched in December 1944, depended on speed and surprise, the very qualities King Tigers were least suited to provide. Narrow forest roads, destroyed bridges, and finally a desperate lack of fuel brought many of these massive machines to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from their own crew's need to abandon them, tanks left intact for lack of a single tank of gasoline. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, collapsed within weeks. By early 1945, Germany's tank factories, battered by relentless Allied bombing, could no longer replace what was being lost on both fronts simultaneously. Jagdpanzers and Jagdtigers, turretless tank destroyers built on Panther and Tiger chassis, were rushed into defensive roles, dug into fixed positions to compensate for dwindling mobile reserves. Crews increasingly consisted of hastily trained teenagers and older reservists thrown into machines that veteran tankers of 1941 would scarcely have recognized as adequately supported. Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east, while American and British armor pushed from the west, and the once feared Panzer divisions that had shattered Poland and France in weeks now fought in isolated pockets with no fuel, no air cover, and no hope of resupply. On May 8th, 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender brought a final silence to battlefields littered with the wrecks of a decade's armoured evolution. From the modest Panzer I that Guderian once demonstrated on a quiet training ground to the monstrous King Tiger abandoned in an Ardennes forest, out of fuel, its war already lost.